Right, welcome back. Now, in this video, we're going to be talking about something called CRUD methodology. As I said earlier, it might sound a little bit rude, but actually it's just a modern way of architecting a software app, and it's something that programmers around the world use today, every day, and have used for a long time. Now, we're going to be looking at it from a completely no-code perspective. We'll talk about what it is, we'll look at a few examples, and hopefully by the end, you'll have a good idea of how you can apply it to your own app and think about it. Now, if you've been following along the lessons chronologically, you've probably just looked at databases, you've looked at relationships, you've looked at variables and data types. All those concepts were quite tricky to get your head around. They were almost technical. So the good news is this is a little bit simpler, and hopefully it will start to bring some of the things you learned in that previous lesson, into a light where they look a little bit more practical and you can start to see how they fit around your own app. So let's dive in, find out what it's all about. Now, CRUD is just essentially a framework, or it's a rule of thumb. It's a way of thinking about the data that you've got and how that can turn into the different functions that your app is going to execute. Now, CRUD actually stands for Create, Read, Update, Delete, and those are simply for really, really basic operations that you can carry out on more or less any database that's out there today. And I've completely made this stat up, but lots of software in the world is made from this. It's architected in this way, or it could be architected in this way. I've used the phrase 80%. That might be completely wrong, but it'll be something like that. It is a really, really, really common way of creating software, and actually it's so common that most no-code tools out there are built with the expectation that you will use this. So as we go through, you might implement this literally. This might be the absolute way for you to build your app. You might stick with it. You might look for a tool that supports it out the box. But it's not the only way to do it. It's a great way. It's a great starting point, but it's not the only way to do it. And so keep that in mind and try to think about, does this fit your app or does it not? The chances are it should. So if you're really, really convinced it doesn't, then brilliant. If you're somewhere in the middle, it might be that CRUD is actually the thing for you. So let's talk a bit more about what it actually is and how it works. So we've got this idea of create, read, update, delete. And if you think about that in terms of a database, if you're going to create, then you're adding a new record to your database table. So take our example that we've kind of had running through this of an e-commerce t-shirt store with customers, inventory, order. Anytime you take a new order in, you're going to create a new record in that order's database. You've then got read. So this is about just getting the data, maybe you want to do something with it. If you look back in our variables lesson, we talked about taking a username from a database. In our demo, we looked at taking an age from a database and displaying that. That would be an example of reading the data. You're going in, you're reading it, and then you're going to take some sort of action on it. You then have updating the data. So if you remember in our demo video, we had an age and then we updated that age. We changed it, I think, from 25 to 26. Similarly, if you ever want to change data in a table, then you would update the record. And if you wanted to just get rid of a record entirely, which actually is usually quite a rare thing to do, then you could delete it. And so there we have create, read, update, delete. And again, I've kind of taken this into a more concrete example here, but imagine you had a database that was going to store a list of all the users on your app. And as you can imagine, you're going to have a name, you're going to have an email address, a password. Well, if we apply the CRUD thinking to it and the CRUD methodology, you're either going to add a new user to the table by creating, you're going to retrieve the user's detail, their name, etc., like our demo, maybe to display it, by reading. If you want to change that user's details, maybe you want to change their email address to a new one, then you're going to be updating it. And if you want to just get rid of that user out of the database, then you would just delete it. Now I'm going to move myself up here as we get through the rest of these slides. So now that we kind of understand create, read, update, delete and what it means, let's kind of have a think about how would you actually apply that to your own app. And this probably takes a few repetitions to get right, so don't worry if you don't get it immediately. But let's have a look at a to-do app. To-do app's a really, really simple idea, and it's also where a lot of people tend to begin either a programming journey or a no-code journey. So if we think about a to-do app, and in our to-do app, we're probably going to have, a list of tasks. We're going to, for every task, we're going to know what is the task, what is it you want to do, when is it due, and who's assigned to the task. So if you think about that, we're probably going to have a database table called tasks, and within that, we're going to have a column for the date. We're going to have a column for, a bit of text that says, well, what is the task? We might have a relationship with our users database to say who's assigned to this task, which user is it. So what CRUD is really about is about taking those four operations, create, read, update, delete, and applying them to every database table. So you're probably going to be able to create a new task or create a new list of tasks or even create a new user. You're probably going to be able to read a task because you want to show the details on the screen. So you've got to retrieve that from your database and you've got to read it from your database and show it. So you might read out a list of all the tasks that are saved. You might read the specific details of a user. And I've kind of given a couple of examples here of how in depth you could get. You could maybe you could read the tasks and then count them to show how many have been completed. You could show which date the user joined the platform on, etc, etc. You might want to update the task to confirm that it's been completed. You might want to change the due date, or you might want to change who is assigned to completing the task. And then just as a quick example, because this popped into my head, if you watched our last video around data types and you looked at Booleans and you kind of struggled to see where those would be useful, a task is a great example. You might have a Boolean field or a true and false field that says, has this task been completed? True or false? Yes or no? There's a great example, and if you were implementing that, then you could update that task to confirm when it has been updated. Completed, that's what I'm looking for. Now, you might delete a task if it's no longer needed, or maybe you might delete a user, delete a list. Now, if you remember on the last slide, I did say that it's very unlikely that you will, or at least it's rare that you would delete something, and usually that's because if you're building an app, quite often if you delete something, you still want it there to be able to show. And so, let's say that you have completed a task. Some people might go, okay, well that's completed, so I can delete that. But the problem is if I completely delete that record from a database, I can't go back and see which tasks I've completed, which is why I sort of said we might want a Boolean or true and false field there that says, okay, this task is complete, and you can just mark it as complete. And then you might customize your app to only show the tasks which are not complete. And we'll have a video actually on how you would do that later. But if something's actually deleted, then it's completely gone. You can't show it to the user later, you can't retrieve it, it's completely dead and gone. And so that's why I'm suggesting that you want to have a kind of true or false in there. But really that's a bit of an aside from CRUD. I just think it's a good way to think about when you really want to use that delete part, because frankly it's pretty rare. Now, let's bring it on to something a wee bit more complicated. A little bit like our e-commerce t-shirt store, Airbnb is a subject that we keep talking about all the way through this, and just because it's well known, it's kind of got a few different relationships, etc. It's a good one to think about. So if you remember, when we're putting together an Airbnb database, we're probably going to have a visitors table, we're going to have a host table, we're going to have a reviews table, we're going to have an apartments table, etc. Stays table as well. So let's now think about how we would put that whole kind of CRUD methodology against that. Now these are just examples. There would be a lot more. If you were really taking Airbnb and trying to draw out how it might work in CRUD, there would be a lot more examples in terms of all the different operations you could do. So I've just put a few examples here to really give you an idea. So let's look at create. First of all, well, we might create a new renter or a new host. We might create a new apartment when the host has updated it. We might create a new stay the minute that a renter or a visitor hits that book stay button. Now you might also read the details of an apartment or stay. Let's say I've got a screen and I want to show the apartment photos, the name of it, the address. Well, I'm going to have to read those details from my database. You might also update an apartment with new photos. You might update a stay with a new check-in time. You might update a renter or a visitor with a new review, and you might also end up just deleting an old apartment or a cancelled stay. Now I've said in the previous slide you would rarely use that, but if you cancel a stay or if you have an old apartment, you don't want it anymore, you just want to delete it as a host, there's a good chance you might not want that in the database anymore. So just really gives you an example, if you were to take those Airbnb databases, write them all out, and then start to write the CRUD operations underneath them, it suddenly you've got your database, and then you've got this almost basic view of the functionality that you want to create on top of it. But I think the other thing that I really want to bring out here is, you know, if you're thinking about how to build something like Airbnb, and I'm sure you're thinking about something else, but you know, if you really take that as an example, people are probably going to say, well, I need to store the apartment data, I need to store the user data, etc., and that's brilliant. But until you really internalize the CRUD methodology, you probably won't think much about the idea that actually, when you think about your functionality, all of it is related to data. It is very difficult to build an app and genuinely have a use case or a function happening where you're not touching data. You know, when you upload an apartment, well, you got to save that apartment. When you upload a review, you got to save that review. You know, when you book a stay, you've got to put something in the database that says this stay now exists with this visitor, etc. And that is really the core point of CRUD. It's this idea that anything that your app does, the chances are it involves saving data to a database. And later on, when we talk about how to bring the four pillars together, and we talk about how they all kind of fit, we kind of go through CRUD as a little bit of an exercise, because it really is a great way of thinking about just how pervasive data is. You know, it really does touch every single part of your app, and that's why it's the first pillar that we've covered. So let's move on a little bit and just think about that in your own app. You know, the way to really think about this, as I'm kind of saying, is to just think about everything that might happen. And it could be the major functionality. Maybe you're building something like Uber, and so the first thing in your head is book a taxi. You know, maybe you're thinking about a food delivery service, and the first thing in your head is look through a menu, pick your food. Whatever it is, all the way from those really important parts, like here's the number one thing I'm doing, right through to the little minutiae. You know, the user logs in, the user uploads a profile photo. Have a think about that. And now that you've started to understand databases, you know, start to think, does that involve data? If the user's signing in, well, I've got to check their name and password. So that's going to be reading the database, because I've got to go and read the username and password I've already got. Is the user signing up? So they've not joined the service, they're not logging in, they're actually creating an account. Well, I've got to create a new record in that database, in that user's database. So try and think about it like that. And even things that don't feel like data quite often are. You know, if you're making a payment, well, you've probably just saved the transaction details somewhere. So try and think about it from that point of view. And it really is about that interaction. You know, if you have a screen or a page which is showing data, then you're reading that data from somewhere. Anytime you use a variable, you know, is that variable going to be pulling data from somewhere? Is it going to be reading it? Is it going to be used to create new data? For example, in the case of a form, is it going to be updating it? You know, so on and so forth. And if the user is going to be doing something that edits something that's already there, so let's say I've got an apartment and you know, I want to change a photo on it, I'm going to be updating data, even though you're probably thinking about, well, they have to upload the photo, we have to check the photo's the right size. That's all important, but from a CRUD point of view, the main action you're taking is updating that apartment record with a new photo. And so just to really underline this, you know, I think this is a great methodology for building your app. The chances are the app you're building will fit under it. There sometimes can be a bit of a kind of 80-20 problem here, and what I mean by that is quite often 80% of your app will fit under CRUD, and that's fine, and the other 20%, you know, you might just have a complicated feature that doesn't feel like it fits under CRUD, or maybe genuinely is not part of CRUD. Don't worry about that. You know, even if your whole app doesn't use CRUD, it doesn't stop you using it, because this is just a framework. It's just a way of thinking. There's not a real you know, it's not like a no-code tool is only going to let you do CRUD, or it's going to enforce that in your whole app. This is just a way of thinking. It's just a way of you understanding what you have to build and how you do it. And it's a really good way, you know, if you've just kind of got a bit of a small idea, like you just think, wow, I know I want to do something like Uber, and I know I kind of have to take some payments and have a map and, you know, order drivers around. This is a good way of just expanding it so that you can understand what the full job is. You know, what is everything that you have to do? What are all the different steps? You know, where does data tie in? And so I think it's a really good way of taking the database and the data type and the variable knowledge and starting to really starting to really bring it to life as an app, because one of the things that you can really do here when you think about variables, so you're then thinking about, well, where do I have to show data on my screens? If you've already got to the point where you can imagine how your app is going to look in your head, then you probably already know where you want to show different pieces of data, like the user's name, a list of drivers, a list of menus, whatever it might be. CRUD is a really good way to kind of say, okay, well, I know where that data is going to be shown, which means I need to read that data, which means I know whenever I need to read it, I'm using a variable to show the data. And if I know I need to read it, then I know I have to have that data in my database. And you can quickly see how, we're only one pillar in so far, and yet you can already start to see how your app is coming to life and how it might start to work. And hopefully that excites you as much as it excites me. Now, I don't have a video demo of a CRUD app and a tool just yet. And the reason is, one of the places CRUD is most commonly used is when you're building APIs or integrations, because quite often, as I've kind of alluded to so far, the point of an API or an integration is to have a common language between different services and different data providers that mean we can access each other's services and data without having to spend weeks and months understanding how their code works. We just have this simple interface. And quite often as a result, because CRUD is so simple and unique, it is just the way that we tend to build APIs. So once you get through the API and integration lesson, you'll find a demo at the end, likely in a tool called Xano, and we'll talk a little bit about how CRUD kind of looks and how it fits in, and we'll take it from there. We'll also talk a little bit about how you can sort of start to write CRUD out. Again, it's a fairly simple process, so you've probably had a good idea from this video alone quite how it works, but later in the lessons we'll talk a little bit more about that, and I'll take you through a couple of examples as well.